Okay, I'm here with Dylan Hoffman. Uh, do I call you doctor? I know you've got a PhD.
Dylan is great.
I didn't spend 4 years in archetypal psychology school not to be called doctor. Okay, good.
Yeah, no, Dylan's good. I hopefully going through a depth psychological program got me to the place where I don't need to be called doctor.
You've transcended that egoic need. Excellent.
But I put the PhD on everything, so
Yeah, well, you got to have your credentials, right? Otherwise, no one takes an archetypal psychologist very seriously.
there you
So,
go.
yeah. Well, for people who don't know you, would you mind just introducing yourself a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, I am currently both co-chair and core faculty member of the Jungian and Archetypal Studies master's and PhD program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And so my time is devoted to that program on as a whole. I dip my toes into other programs at Pacifica, like depth psychology and creativity. But for the most part, my work is devoted to sort of the general parameters of C.G. Jung's and James Hillman's work, and we work through that in our curriculum in a fairly systematic way. And that's what the Jungian Archetypal Studies program is devoted to.
Hmm. Well, there's like a number of things that we could talk to. I mean, I'm a big fan of James Hillman, and he doesn't get spoken about enough with some depth and understanding of his work, you
Right.
know. But one of the things that I was intrigued by was that you also are a fan of Vine Deloria,
Yes.
and you actually assigned one of his books in your curriculum, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Well, I was a long time getting to Vine Deloria because I think I had this idea that he was, and I think it has to do with the design of one of his book covers that I encountered. I had kind of lumped him in with the kind of Bear and Company, kind of
Right.
indigenous revival thing that happened in the 90s. And I looked at his name, I thought, who's this Italian guy talking about indigenous spirituality?
Right.
And I didn't investigate any more into it until I don't know, something came along like fairly recently, and I said, "Oh, this guy sounds really interesting." And I
Yeah.
actually picked up God is Red and was totally blown away. I loved what he was talking about and the way that he talked about it. I see like his work as part of this larger project I've been involved in of decolonizing first of all, my own psyche,
Right.
but then trying to decolonize psychology at large. And the book that you assign is called C.G. Jung and the Sioux Traditions. And it's an indigenous person commenting on Jung's ideas about the so-called primitive and indigenous people. Um, Jung's few encounters with real indigenous people have been really made into a big deal for Jungians who want to see him as this very well-rounded and worldly person. But Vine is can be critical of a lot of the assumptions and generalizations that Jung makes, right?
Correct.
So that's what I'd like to dive into with you because not many, I mean, no one's talking about it. So I'm
Yeah.
glad you're out there. So first of all, like maybe to begin, what do you think about this idea of decolonizing psychology? Is that something that I mean, does that mean anything to you? And if so, what do you think that entails, or why is it required?
Yeah. No, it's an incredibly important idea project in psychology in general, in my work with depth psychology in particular, because it makes conscious or brings into awareness the fact that our normative descriptions of anything, the mind or human nature in particular, the psyche, so to speak, carries the weight of history in those descriptions, and not just sort of the weight of history in the abstract, but the history of marginalization, the history of colonization. And so if you bring a decolonial eye to psychology and depth psychology, you inevitably see a hierarchical arrangement in how different people groups are described, and who's placed sort of at the developmental pinnacle of what we take as normative maturity, rationality. And so if we don't decolonize depth psychology, we simply perpetuate a racist, hierarchical, colonizing perspective with every student that comes through it. We essentially colonize their intellectual space with the same ideas that we're used to literally colonize others. And so to work on decolonization is essentially trying to unpack, or at least make conscious, those assumptions that are carried into the classroom that are being absorbed as if they are norms and reality itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think at the foundation of that is this view of consciousness as an evolutionary process.
Right.
That at some point there was a less evolved consciousness, which has been described by Jung as participation mystique from
Right.
Lévi-Bruhl, the primitive, the lower level,
Yeah.
abaissement niveau, like all these terms are pointing toward levels. But what I was thinking about was pondering, like, does Jung actually value them at a lower level, or does he just recognize that we all carry a kind of ancestral history with us, and he saw that as levels. He even had that famous dream about the psyche as house, and he goes down in the basement. And there's like the bones of his indigenous ancestors or whatever, right? But did he value the lower levels less? It at times seems to, like, it's what we want to strive for, is to not get caught in this kind of undifferentiated consciousness of the primitive, but we want to rise above that into differentiation and then
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think it's both. And this is where I think makes Jung difficult to categorize in very neat either or places, because there is absolutely emphasis in his work on the detriment of losing rapport with our ancestral primordial sort of depths, which he either describes as primitive or ancestral or archaic, using less or more baggage language around that. But he does value that place at least as equal to consciousness, if not more. Where the language gets problematic for Jung is that the relationship between those deeper strata of the psyche and consciousness he sees as essentially assimilating the deeper layers to consciousness, and seeing the danger of consciousness being too captured by those deeper layers. And so there is connotations that should we lose ourselves to those deeper layers, we're essentially regressing. And that is sort of carries the connotation that those depths are less rational, less human, more animalic, all those kind of connotations, which are again carry this weight of language and history that do devalue indigenous ancestral ways of being as less developed than European consciousness. I think for me, this is rooted in this idea that was prominent in Jung's day called recapitulation theory. And it was sort of became a standard way to articulate this evolution of consciousness that you're talking about, that every human being carries these layers with them, and the closer you get to the child and the animal, the farther back in history you are seeing human levels of consciousness. And there was a really explicitly racist theory, and was used to say, oh, well, where are the Asians on this map? Where are Africans? And of course they were all lower on the developmental spectrum and therefore reflected earlier stages of consciousness.
Right, like the childlike savage.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that idea was so taken for granted that and adopted into depth psychology in particular, that its filaments have a lot of undoing. It's just such for me, a horrific assumption that is normative in depth psychological discourse that has to be rooted out at the core.
Uprooted. Yeah, I agree. And one of the few prominent depth psychologists, I think, who addressed that in his own way was James Hillman.
Yeah.
I mean, Hillman was really good at doing the deconstruction of some of these norms and assumptions that are just kind of unconsciously accepted as some kind of truth, either because they came from the mouth of Jung himself, or
right.
And so Hillman was really great at doing the deconstruction, but I don't know how close he ever got to the kind of the root system of what we might call, like Martin Prechtel has this term, the indigenous soul.
Right.
The idea that at the core of each of us is a soul that's deeply connected to the earth and to nature and to ritual and things like that. I don't know how close Hillman got to that. He went as far as the Greeks, but he was such a kind of mid-Atlantic fella.
Yes.
I can't really see him going down to the Amazon and drinking some ayahuasca and going, oh, okay,
Yeah.
there's something. What do
Well,
you think about him and his project? How it relates to decolonization?
yeah. Well, I mean, I think sort of his polytheistic stance inherently deconstructs sort of privileging a normative narrative about the psyche or human nature, and doesn't create a hierarchy in the psyche itself between this place and that. Everything has to be equally tended as equally expressive of psychological life. So that is a really powerful lens that lends itself to indigenous ways of thinking and experiencing. I do think he, particularly at the revisioning psychology lecture book phase, he's still basically assuming European normativity with Greek Roman myth as being sort of the given psychological mythical background of psychological life. What's really interesting though is that toward the end of his life, and I just finished working with a gentleman named Dick Russell on the official biographies of Hillman.
Yeah, I just had him on the podcast, right?
Perfect.
And so, yeah, you were one of his copy editors, I think,
Yes.
right? Or the copy editor.
Yeah,
right.
For the last two volumes. So, but what struck me about particularly the end of volume 2 and volume 3 is he started working with the men's movement, as it was called, which got into for some people, problematic territory of ritual and appropriation, but there were members of the men's movement that were genuine indigenous elders, and Hillman began to appreciate their work much more thoroughly than tends to come through in his earlier work. And then by the, maybe last decade of his life, he was making trips to Japan like yearly, if not more than yearly, and started appreciating Shinto sensibilities, and he gets to a place where I'd never really heard him talk positively about indigenous perspectives, but he gets to a place where he's doing a lecture on beauty and ecology, and he's framing it as this multiplicity, interdependent recognition of the cosmos. And he makes this shift to say, and this is what indigenous people have been saying. This worldview I'm now articulating in Western terms, I now realize what is what has been already articulated in indigenous communities. And you see this shift of making that an equivalent of what used to be for him a European privileged position. He now sees it in relative terms in relationship to indigenous ways of speaking and thinking about the cosmos. And that, for me, was a very sort of affirmative moment that comes out in the biographies of his recognition of where he gets in a very developed European mythic perspective to say, oh, and this is, I'm getting to a place where people have already been. And I love that recognition in him.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like his whole project, like against Jungianism and against Christianism, monotheism. He was doing his own project of decolonizing without consciously thinking,
Correct.
I need to decolonize. I mean, he might have actually used some of that terminology at some point, and so he got to a point late in life where this whole other appreciation opened up to him, like, oh, because like in his work, he only goes so far south
Correct.
as the Mediterranean. He
Yes.
keeps saying like we have to go south. We've had too much northern thinking. We got to go south. But he stops at the Mediterranean. It's like, get on a boat, Jim.
Yes.
There's more. There's more further south, and they have a
Yeah.
lot of interesting things to say about this polytheistic worldview and
Yes.
the animate world. um, it's a kind of a shame that he didn't have a chance to articulate that in depth in his work at the end of his life,
I agree.
but yeah, you do hear hints of it in some of these lectures that you can dig out. And I'm sure Dick Russell, because of his experience with Malidoma Some and
Yes.
going to Africa with his son, wanted to draw some of that out and get it down
Yes.
on the record, right?
Yeah, because that relationship between Dick Russell, his son, and Malidoma Some doesn't happen without James Hillman. James Hillman is the one that says you need to go meet with Some. And
Yeah, it's like the one African shaman that Hillman knew.
yes, yes. Um, but it says I think Malidoma opened up Hillman in ways that Hillman didn't realize he could be opened up. I think that relationship changed Tillman in ways that didn't ever fully make it into his work, which is disappointing and sad, because I think the threads are starting to show up later in his work, and it just doesn't come as explicitly out as I think it could have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think Malidoma could speak his language because he did have the Western education before his own kind of indigenous initiation, back into his mother tribe. Um, And I think Hillman needed that, right? Like he
Yes,
needed that to respect the person on the intellectual
right.
level.
And that's why Vine Deloria for me is such a valuable scholar, because you can't read his work and say and think anything other than this guy's absolutely brilliant. And so when I have students read him, like, just the process of reading him to me challenges, oh, I'm reading a Native American author, whatever that might mean. He is so supremely brilliant that you just have to reposition your intellectual stance to engage with him. And I think just that experience itself is valuable to find someone that is not just capable of reading Jung, but capable of critiquing Jung in Jung's own language.
Yeah.
And it's just an incredible embodiment of his capacity to engage in conversation, to affirm and also critique, and all in the space of being an Indigenous author who is second to none intellectually to anyone else we're reading.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and a very polemic author and activist.
yes,
He wasn't some soft shoe
no,
intellectual scholar. I mean, he was boots on the ground
yes,
activist with this really deep scholarly background and religious background too,
yes,
in both the Christian church and his own native traditions.
yeah,
Like he's like the perfect guy to come up against Jung.
yes.
Like maybe the only guy who could do it from that side of things, like from the
I
indigenous perspective, right?
correct, because he's going to affirm the value of the numinous religious spiritual background to life just as much as he's going to be able to critique really sort of detailed points of philosophy or whatever the case may be. So it's impossible for me it's impossible to dismiss Deloria. And so you find yourself entering intellectual domains and concepts because you just at least have to appreciate the sophistication, the warmth, the holisticness of his perspective. It's
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
fantastic.
it's so true. Like you can't dismiss him.
Yeah,
Uh, like Hillman, people dismiss him quite a bit, if they don't like what he says or how he challenges uh, these kind of sacred
right,
concepts. They'll say, well, he quit being a clinician really early on. He
right.
had kind of father issues with Jung. He was anti-establishment. He had these kind of this chip on his shoulder. He himself, whatever,
Yeah,
on and on and on, right? And so they can dismiss him, and also like the kind of his language can be quite difficult to get
yeah,
into, whereas Deloria is more kind of straight and clear and
yeah,
easy to understand. So the ideas are more um, apparent
yes.
when you read him.
Because I think in some cases Hillman isn't really concerned with the person on the street, so to speak, of like needing to bridge what he's talking about to the everyday. I think Deloria is sort of inherently relational in his articulation of everything, that he's not leaving anyone out of the conversation, both sort of the community member that's sort of on the reservation or elsewhere in the world, and the intellectual that's sitting in a academic department. He just, to me, has a sensibility for bridging that Hillman sometimes can be lacking.
Yeah. Well, right there is how the indigenous perspective is expressed in relationship,
Yeah.
in communication style, versus Hillman. As much as he railed against the North, it's a kind of a very northern kind of
Yes.
attitude of the intellectual to
Meet
not.
meet me up here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He's the hill man. You got to go
Yes.
meet him up there, even though he hated hills, but
Yes.
he was more into valleys.
Yeah.
But it didn't show. I mean, he tried in Soul's Code. I think he was really
Yes.
pressed to do something that was more accessible. And I think it's a great book, but I'm sure the editor did a lot of heavy lifting on that book.
Yes. And that book also comes out of that turn in his life where he's participating in the men's movement. So it
Right.
even reflects a bit of oh, I'm having conversations with people that I'm not normally having conversations with. And I think that grew out of that. But I agree. I think it was probably an effort for an effort of doing something that wasn't normal for him.
Hmm. Um, do you know how Vine Deloria got introduced to Jung? Was it just because he was so widely read, or was there something in particular that grabbed him?
I don't know. It's a great question. I think it's probably because he just one of I think his larger projects in his work is to find resonant voices that are sort of that carry marginalized, unaddressed things that modernity had left out. He has, I'm going to miss the title. I think it's called The Metaphysics of Modernity or something like that, where he talks about Jung and he talks about several sort of scientists or different philosophers who are carrying voices in the West that Western scientism doesn't make room for. And so I think
Hmm.
he just has a project where he's not just so-called championing indigenous purity or something like that, where he's like, I have the value of this tradition and I want to find contact points in Western culture that can provide narrative threads to counter the dominant narratives happening. And I think Jung was one of those people that he found some level of contact or continuity between himself and indigenous perspective enough to have a conversation with. And so I think some of that contact came out of that larger intellectual relational project that carries through his work.
Right. Yeah. Kind of recognizing in Jung a potential ally
Yes,
for Deloria's larger project of, I would say, decolonizing the the anima mundi or the global psyche in a way.
correct.
Because, yeah, I mean, there, the thing about when we talk about decolonization that is always a sticking point for me that I don't hear addressed enough is I can't separate colonization from Christianity. To
Nor
me,
can I.
they're inseparable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Colonization doesn't happen without Christianity,
Yeah,
at least to the degree that it's happened.
correct. Not like when we're talking about what actually happened, you can't you cannot separate it from Christianity. And not what I have a problem with as it is the idea that it maybe expresses a side of Christianity gone awry. I don't think that's true. I think it expresses something inherent to to Christianity, the idea that here's a particular figure that holds the truth, all other ways of knowing become irrelevant, and therefore go make every other assimilate to this. And I don't, to me, that's inherent to a Christian worldview. You can't take the two apart.
Mhm.
So I completely agree with you on that.
Well, and that's the core belief that that fuels colonization. Like you
Yes.
really have to believe that you're on God's mission
Yes.
in order to do what people have done, and to travel the great distances and take the risks in, you know, it's
Yeah.
incredible what it's done. And I find myself sometimes caught up in this fantasy of like what would happen if um, Paul of Tarsus like broke his leg on
Right.
before he could get out and kind of
Right.
start missionizing. Like how the world could have been so different. I mean, everything we know of the past 2,000 years would be radically different. It's had that kind of universal effect on most of the globe.
Yes. I agree. I think there's a part of me that that feels like if we want to take it back another layer, that Christianity itself expresses a possibility of the human psyche that would find some expression in some ideology, but the way it happened in Christianity became a vehicle for a global normative divine revelation that gives me permission to take from you and and dismiss any truth value or counterposition because you simply don't have the God's eye view that I do. Like that is so toxic and inherent to Christianity. I do think that there's that decolonization has to come up against that, or it's sort of bucking the task. If they want, if you try to decolonize without facing Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've thought about this because when I talk to some people, people of European descent or people who live in Europe still, I don't think they understand why I'm so sensitive to issues around colonization. But it has to do with the place where I live. Uh, it's not very common, I think, in North America to live right down the road from a reservation in one direction
Right.
and having another one down the other direction. Like it wasn't until I moved to this island that has a really high native population, on a small landmass, where I was really confronted with the effects of colonization.
Right.
And so I just, I started, uh, letting people know that yes, I may be a little more sensitive to it, but here's why. And
Yeah.
so even if you don't think it's important, I think it is because I see the real effects every day. Uh, so I just want to make that clear to people, why it's important to me as a settler, as a non-Indigenous person, why it's important. It's because it's a compassion for humanity.
Right. Yeah.
You
And
know.
for me, like the only possibility for colonialism to actually sort of be stemmed and decolonial efforts can only progress to the extent that those who would typically be colonizers begin decolonizing themselves in their own perspectives. Otherwise, it's just a fragment of humanity doing the work. And it's like, no, we have to address the colonizer in everyone, or like this is just a side project. It's just a fetish. It's like the people, it can't just be an indigenous person work. It can't be, or it'll stop at that line. Um, but I'm glad you bring that up because I live in an area of Colorado where it's this, I'm in the same experience. I have Navajo and Ute reservations close by. And to sort of give context to my own sensitivity to it, I am half Mexican. Um, my mom's Mexican, and part of my history in Colorado is that my family comes from an area that's about an hour from here called the San Luis Valley, where uh, Mexican, Pueblo, Ute, I believe, tribes sort of intersected when the area was not the United States. And so my family is indigenous to that area of Colorado, southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, that for my family, we're living in Mexican territory when that then became the United States at a certain point. I remember having conversations with my grandmother about migration stories, like when did we come from Mexico? And there was absolute
It's
silences.
like, no, they just moved the line.
Yes, eventually, like through the
We
help of
never
my
left
wife,
Mexico.
it was like, oh no, the what used to be just sort of land that we lived on, our space, our domain became the United States. All of a sudden, we belonged to someone else or something else, and our land was then available to other
Wow.
people to do with what they wish. So that's my own sort of background in relationship to this conversation.
Yeah. Um, but growing up in um, Anglo North America, you were subjected to a lot of the conditioning that all of us were, even people who,
Absolutely.
almost full blood, 100% European mutt.
Right.
There's a lot mixed in there, but
Yeah.
all my people are from Europe. Um, but yeah, it's still how our minds were shaped from
Yes.
the get go. Um, Now, oh God, this is I think, an important topic, particularly not separating Christianity and colonization.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big one, because Jung himself was the kind that he wrestled and struggled a lot
Yeah.
with Christianity, and he never became kind of an anti-Christian or a post-Christian, I think, in his lifetime. I don't think he ever really let go of it.
There's places in his work where I don't know if he stays there, but he at least sort of goes over the line to say, I'm not a Christian. And then he'll come back and say, basically, culturally, I'm a Protestant
Yeah,
Christian. That's sort of the space I occupy. But I don't, from my reading of him, don't think he felt at home in Christianity at at least as sort of like a permanent place where he felt described his perspective on things. I think he goes back and forth over that line. There's a lot of deconstruction of Christianity, but there's also a lot just left in place. And so I think that's also part of the decolonizing of depth psychology is often how Christian depth psychology still is,
yeah.
in some ways. So
Well, even Hillman admitted that,
yeah,
got a Jewish background. He said, look, this is basically a Christian form or
yeah,
practice. Uh, yeah, okay, so that's really interesting about Jung. Like, I wonder if something like that attracted Vine to his work was he saw Jung trying to deconstruct the the kind of Christian conditioning
right,
and true, like honestly and sincerely wrestling with it and like wrestling with it in public.
yeah,
I mean, some of the way that Jung wrestles with Christianity is so kind of personal that it's like it, it borders on unprofessional.
right,
And this
yeah,
isn't in his memoir, even. It's like in his
yes,
works.
yes, yeah. No, I mean, in his uh book Ion,
Mm,
he like he's really transgressing his cultural norms. He starts talking about wholeness, and he goes, what I'm talking about is can be symbolized by Christ, but Christ fails to live up to what I'm trying to describe as psychological wholeness, which entails sort of the full spectrum of psychological life, not just goodness, light, spirit. And so he has places where he's explicitly um, challenging those norms in ways that I think the general reader in his time would have found very uncomfortable to read. And but I think he felt sort of compelled to go into those areas because I do think he felt that it was destructive to not start pulling some things apart
mhm.
psychologically. Yeah.
Well, especially how he saw, like, well, there's this thing because he's critical of the Protestant Reformation because it removed a lot of the kind of symbolic containers that held all of these archetypal
Right.
forces and kept them at bay, called it like kind of defense against the
Right.
power of these forces, and we don't want to unleash them. When we do, when we take those away, we get World War I and
Right.
World War II. Like, so at the same time, he's almost like asking us to return to a Catholic approach to Christianity with all of the icons and symbols and rituals and
Right.
everything, and the Mass in Latin. And I think a lot of Jungians, when they are Christians, that's what they kind of go to because
Yeah.
it looks like, okay, Jung's saying if we are going to be a Christian, we better be Catholic, like, or
Right.
and even like kind of Eastern Orthodox is even better
Right.
because there's more symbols and icons.
Right.
And I'm like, no, no, you guys don't get it. I mean, the
No.
whole project from the get-go is a failure, and it's done nothing for the planet.
Yeah. No. I I sort of cringe at when I see people making that reading of what he's saying because he has another essay called "The Symbolic Life," where he says what I'm really trying to talk about, and he uses the term primitive, but a symbolic way of engaging with life as a whole, not, and he's talking to a group of priests, I think, and explicitly contrasting what he's doing with simply a return to Christianity of any form. That the positioning of value between Protestant and Catholic isn't sort of an endpoint, but a way to say humans have always needed ritual, symbolic ways of mediating, experiencing, participating in the world. And if you're going to pick between Protestant and Catholic, Catholic still has some of this, but it's not like it's the epitome of the symbolic life. It's just better in relative terms than zero symbols or zero rituals that have been stripped by Protestantism. So yeah, I think for people to read Jung as like he's telling us to go back to the Catholic Church, I think misses the point entirely.
Yeah, I think Jordan Peterson went down that road to a
Yes,
certain degree. He's been kind of getting more Catholic as the years go on, and he hasn't
correct.
stopped talking about Jung. And I'm like, dude,
Yeah,
I don't think you're fully getting the message here.
correct.
But he's on his own mission.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, does he come up in your courses? Do people bring him up as an example of how to read religion symbolically and not literally, and then how it can work for us if we just kind of keep that intellectual distance from it?
Not often. Not as often as I would have thought he would enter conversations. I've I've probably had Peterson brought up a couple of times in the last, in the entire time I've been teaching, which started in 2017. So he's not prominent, and I don't, I'm glad on the one hand, uh, but on the other hand, he's so has such a place with certain populations in America and elsewhere that I'm surprised by how little he's come up as how to do things or his attitude towards certain things.
Well, in certain kind of liberal circles, I think he's like a persona non grata. Like
Yeah,
we don't even mention his name around
yeah,
here. But I think like he's one of those people you got to reckon to because he's out there and he's talking about Jung, he's talking
yeah.
about religion. Um, and like for me, it's like he's almost there. He's almost there.
Yes. I
But
read him and I have that same of I'm I like you're saying the things, but something there's some also fundamental missing it at the same time. And it's a weird he occupies a weird psychological space that I understand his appeal for certain groups, but when it comes to Jung, I'm just like I don't know where you ended up going. I don't there's some divergence that just it's almost like a visceral feeling of like something's
something's off.
yeah,
Yeah. Hard to articulate, right? But here's something I think is telling. I remember during a Q&A after one of his lectures that I saw online, somebody was asking him like where to begin with Jung, I think. And so they brought up Ion. He said, "Oh no, man, Ion's dangerous. Be careful with that book." Right? And I
yeah,
go, why does he think it's so dangerous? Well, because like you're talking about, Jung is deconstructing uh, the kind of supremacy of
yes,
Christianity as the pinnacle religion, as the kind of
yes,
yeah, and like he does fall into that sometimes, like talking about Christianity as this like pinnacle
yes,
of not only evolution of consciousness but evolution of like religious expression.
correct,
And a lot of people see it that way. Like a Jonathan Pageau, I hear him talk about that. It's like we refined everything until we got to this like
yeah,
the most amazing, the perfect story to help us
yes,
with our lives, right? And I'm like, oh my god.
yeah,
Uh, but I think like something that like Peterson's not able to fully let go of it because he's afraid of what would happen in him
yeah,
if he were like he's not willing to go there. It's like he'll talk about the power of psychedelics to change people's minds, but he's not going to do them
correct. No,
because
I
it's a control thing, right?
absolutely. I think that is sort of the thing that makes him, for me, non-depth psychological is because he's wanting to sort of close off the mysteries with some like here's some like clear answers to things rather than deconstructing our answers. There's something about him that appeals to the need for
Mm-hmm.
some certainties rather
Mm-hmm.
than loosening our grip on those things. And I think maybe that's where I feel this cross purposes of his work and depth psychology in general is like with my students, I'm trying to unravel those certainties to have them fall into other ways of being and experiencing life that doesn't require the scriptures to provide the answers. Like, and I think that's where he goes in the other way of life's very chaotic. Here's
Just literally the antidote to chaos. I mean, that's the
yes,
subtitle
yes,
of his book, The
right,
Antidote to Chaos. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know if you kind of look at him from an archetypal perspective
yes,
about the nature of his relationship to the quote unquote feminine
right,
or chaos. It's like, do we need an antidote to chaos,
right.
Dr. Peterson?
Is it
Who
chaos?
asked for it?
Yes. Yeah, the way he characterizes the the other, like chaos, like a dangerous zone, like all of that is like, well, you're revealing more than you're intending to
Yeah,
say.
you're showing your limits of
Yeah,
experience and capacities there. Yeah. Well, and the key thing is he's not a depth psychologist.
no,
He's like basically a neuroscience, cognitive behavioral type
yes,
psychologist who relies on statistics a lot.
yes,
Uh, but he kind of appropriates Jung to, I think, support his religious mission or,
correct.
or something. Yeah. Like there is an appropriation of Jung there, I think.
There is, which I
He's
think,
not he's not willing to go to the depths that Jung went to, which was like
no,
kind of a madness.
yeah, no, and I think maybe that's why what bothers me is I feel like there is a misuse and an exploitation that of Jung and depth psychology to normalize things that are trying to be denormalized by depth psychology and Jung, and that bothers me. Yeah.
Mm. Oh, it feels good to have this conversation. I mean, I can't have this conversation with many people, I don't think. So I'm glad it came up. I feel like I've had some therapy.
Yes. Same. Same.
Um, I'm interested. Let's get back to Vine Deloria and Jung.
Okay.
So, how would you say, like, I think we've touched on it a little bit, but could you be a bit more explicit about what Vine Deloria appreciated about Jung in terms of like the Western psyche or the colonial psyche?
Well, I think he appreciated probably two things most, that Jung felt that human beings are inherently religious, and therefore there's no sort of non-religious way to participate in the world that isn't going to be symptomatic in some way. And so religiousness is either acknowledged or deformed in
Right,
some way.
it's either dealt with or it's distorted into some
Correct.
ideology or something. Yeah.
Correct. And so I think Deloria resonated with that of it's just a given. So what do you do with that given? And then secondly, the value of dreams and non-rational ways of knowing that Jung valued and found integral to life as a whole, I think was another level of congruence with Vine Deloria's perspective in general of there's ways of receiving information or engaging with the world that transcend or do not participate or require the validation of measurements and calculations. And so that's where he fundamentally sort of finds a valid conversational partner in Jung. And one of the reasons that I think he's such an incredible person to have in conversational spaces like this is because, for lack of a better word, he doesn't take the places where Jung is absolutely colonialist in outlook and then say, well,
Hmm.
then I can't talk to this person.
Yeah. He's a mature
Fine.
man, Vine
Yes.
Deloria.
And so when I have students read him, I'm like, this embodies what I hope academic will mean for you of what can I affirm about this and what can't I affirm, and those can be in relationship to the same person, the same tradition, and therefore you also, when someone comes along and sees what you couldn't see about your own work or perspective, isn't going to dismiss you simply because you fundamentally failed in some respects. Like, so you were just,
Yeah, or you don't fulfill all the criteria of
right,
what they value as being a good person or whatever.
right.
Yeah.
And Vine,
Yeah. So again, there's that capacity
yes,
for oppositionality, for contradiction, for paradox that is essential to being, I think, a healthy, mature person. But also,
yes,
like, God, if these people are going to be therapists, please, God, let them
correct.
have this capacity.
Yes. And I think it's surprising for, let's say, I mean, just, white students to be reading an Indigenous author who isn't angry. Like,
Yeah.
that is just like, I'll deal with you intellectually, like you missed it, but like I have a capacity to listen, respond, critique, affirm. Like, I think there's so many assumptions in reading an Indigenous author that he again just deconstructs in the course of being himself in
Yeah.
conversation. And so I have students that feel surprised that he just doesn't come out railing against the racist Jung, but it's just like, well, of course there's this in Jung, but there's also this of value. And it sets a norm for conversation and dialogue that I don't know anyone else that does as well, uh, in portraying that, who could be very dismissive uh, of Jung, but isn't. And so,
Yeah. Well, he's from another time. And I think one of the things that's happened to activism is it's really been, I don't know how to say this, but run by like young people who
yeah,
maybe haven't acquired that capacity for paradox and contradiction to coexist. So it
yes,
comes out as one-sided and
yes,
and always in the negative. And so you throw the baby out with the bathwater, just get rid of the whole thing. It's all toxic. It's all problematic.
yes,
Like I've had, I posted about Jung maybe speaking about, I don't know, whatever. I posted things online about Jung, and sometimes I get this critique from people who go on and go, he was a racist. In this book, he said this. I'm like, okay, but what do you think of his ideas?
yeah, no. And I think it fundamentally sort of reflects a state of awareness that hasn't absorbed self-limitation yet.
Mhm.
And so it's like it reflects a state of awareness that I obviously know more than this person knows and therefore can see what they can't see, but it doesn't self-reflexively turn that lens towards their own views to say, oh, at some point I'm going to find out, or others are going to find out my points of limitation and not being able to see certain things. And I think that probably comes with age, running into a few points of being arrogantly convinced of the rightness of your own perspective and finding out you are wrong. And then you realize, oh, someone can be very good and have good intention and be trying to articulate something as well as they can and fundamentally miss it because I have experienced how I can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it could come with age, but I don't think it's a given.
No, no.
And like interestingly, I recorded a podcast with Eric Davis, um, who I don't know if you know his work, but
No.
he was considered a kind of technology guru. He wrote a book in the 90s called Technosis,
Right.
GNOSIS, and he's done a lot of great writing since. But we were talking about like being Gen Xers, what we might have to offer the world, how technology has kind of really changed or affected the generations since, and but we got in this whole conversation about limits and valuing of limits, and that relating to the kind of technology that is so pervasive now, being about there being no limits. Everything's open, everything's available all the time. And I think it has this kind of effect on the psyche. Um, Not even just like a not a valuing of limits, but actually thinking that limits are bad. That
Right, 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 right.
limits are gatekeeping, they're white supremacist, all this kind of stuff. And I think it's like from a depth psychological point of view, a problem with the Senex. But
Yeah, yeah.
we can,
And it's just a fundamental sort of non-perception of positionality in relationship to yourself. Everyone else is in a position, but I'm not. I have, which to me is an unconscious Christianity. I can inhabit a God's eye perspective and therefore see all the failures of everyone else, but I'm not included in that evaluation. Like I I don't share in those same limitations, which is a very inflated perspective to occupy. Um, yeah.
yeah,
Anyway.
very inflated,
Yeah.
inflated to a God
Yes.
size. I mean, I didn't even know this growing up. I went to a Roman Catholic high school, not because I was Roman Catholic, but because they had the only music program where you could go in as a guitar player and be part of the music program because the
Right.
music teacher was a great guitar player. So I kind of did this pseudo conversion for a few years so I could, get my music fix.
Oh,
Um, but I didn't even know until like fairly recently that Catholic means universal. Like
oh yeah.
that's the project from the get go was to
Correct.
make this a universal religion.
Yes.
Um, and if you don't see a problem with that, like I don't know if I can make space for you in my life. Let's put it that way.
No, that and what strikes me is like how not troubling that view is. And because it's so pervasive in the West as like, oh, well, of course, we want a science that explains everything. Our religion explains everything.
Our psychology,
All all difference and distinction should, of course, be subsumed under a universal purview. And it's like that is whenever that's enacted, many, many people suffer.
yeah, including the people who are within the belief system, actually.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's one of the keys to getting the settlers on board with this project of decolonization is to show them like what was lost in a
Correct.
way. And I think Hillman did a really good job of that and opening people up to, maybe going as far as he could in
Yeah.
terms of like, well, let's look at Greek polytheism. We can all
Right.
kind of agree that Greek culture is one of the foundation stones for Western culture, right? Okay, well, look what's in here. Isn't this
Right.
amazing? And then alchemy. Ooh, there's something kind of interesting and animistic in a way.
Right.
So he went as far as he could. But what I'm kind of left with now is like wondering, okay, so if we're striving, a few of us, working toward a kind of post-Christian, post-colonial Western world, uh, what does that inherent religious impulse get replaced with? Because I think that's true. We all you have to do is look up at the night sky to feel small and powerless, and that there's some greater power at work organizing all of
Right.
this. I mean, you just have to have your eyes open in nature to get that.
Right.
Oh, and that's really kind of like frightening and scary. And so I think we do need religious practice to mediate that relationship with the vast mystery. So, and I've had friends say, "Well, I think psychology can substitute that." And my problem with psychology is that, yeah, if it's the right psychology,
Right.
like an animistic, imaginal psychology, like Hillman's, I think that gives us a great framework. What I think where it's lacking is in practices.
Correct.
Like, and Deloria, I think, understood this that we need practices beyond dream journal, beyond doing active imagination in a room with a therapist you're paying
Right.
$250 an hour with. So my project over the past number of years is to bring a depth psychological understanding to kind of shamanic technologies,
Right.
and to do that in public,
Right.
in circles with groups, as a kind of ritual, but non-dogmatic.
Right.
And so I've been trying to sort that out, and I've come up with like a number of different practices that I think extend uh, the theories of Jung and Hillman into practice, which is where, I'm a practitioner. You
Right.
know, I'm good at practice, not so good at like writing big books on things.
Right.
So I don't know, but I've looked around and I haven't seen like Jungians or Hillmanians really pushing toward more practice and incorporating kind of shamanic technologies. Like I call it archetypal shamanism because I think all
Right.
these practices are beyond culture. They're just technologies that work to help open us up to the imaginal and archetypal realms.
Yeah, no, I think it's a an edge of depth psychology that people like you, I myself am trying to push that edge into. This can't just be intellectually occupied space, like,
Yeah.
because inevitably, at least in my sense for things, what you end up doing will supersede your intellectual space in terms of how you actually experience the world. And so if animism, enchantment is a really romantic idea that you find comforting, but you don't do anything in relationship to actual things that conveys your real relationship with the world, then you're betraying that you don't actually think that the world is alive in that way. Because if you did, you would be in relationship in ways like you are with other things that you take for real relational beings. So I view my wife as a real relational being that makes me do things in certain ways. If I experience the world in that same way, it's going to come with responsibilities and ways of relating that are just as real. And if that doesn't happen, again, that betrays where I really think relational reality resides. And so it's a limit, it's a place in depth psychology that I think Jungians and even archetypal psychologists feel like if you start enacting something, you're literalizing it, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore, and that's a negative thing. For me, it's just the proof in the pudding is in the doing, so to speak. And so
Yeah.
I have a problem of it just being devalued as literalization, as if we shouldn't embody what we actually experience in the world.
Yeah. So well said. I couldn't agree more. Um, I think some of it has to do, like, I get the sense that some of these, a lot of people in depth psychology are upper middle class
Yeah,
intellectuals. And I think a lot of them, there's an embarrassment or shame about performing ritual,
yeah.
like about going out and singing to the sun or to the ocean or whatever it might be. I think there's a kind of, yeah, and that's part of the Christian conditioning, I think.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
It's like, well, I can't. There's something psychologically that labels that as primitive. I
primitive
can't.
or superstitious or
Superstitious, something that is like
new age, woo woo,
something that's backwards or regressive or
not
not as
sophisticated.
yes, correct.
Yeah,
But I again I when people actually experience something in a particular way, they have no problem enacting that reality.
I know, right. And that's where you can tell if it's really sunk down to the deepest core of a person, is if there is no self-consciousness about these kind of simple animistic rituals
Correct.
or gestures. Not even
Correct.
ritual, that sounds too highfalutin, but a gesture,
Yeah.
saying good morning to the sun,
Yes.
like something as
Yes.
simple as that.
If I walked by someone I know without acknowledging them,
Such
they
disrespect.
it's disrespect, and I'm displaying my disregard. And so like there's something about like even the houses we occupy, the cars we occupy, and the trees and everything surrounding is like, if I don't acknowledge the presence and the animation in things, then it's not neutrality, it's disregard. It's not, there's no neutral position between, in a relational cosmos, there's no neutrality. Like, you honor the relationship or you're being rude.
Yeah, I
And
know,
so,
like etiquette.
yes, exactly.
Which is falling into or falling out of style, I think, in our culture these days. It's something
Yeah.
I gripe over to my wife quite a bit, actually. The lack of like courtesy and etiquette,
Yes.
like which used to be common courtesy to
Yes.
say hello to someone passing by. It's one of the things that I love about actually going down south. Walking through the jungle in the Amazon, you pass by these little villages, and I remember like everybody I'd pass would give a smile and say "Hola, amigo."
Yeah.
And you don't have to stop and like, take up too much time, but it's a gesture, it's an acknowledgement. I see you. I
Yeah.
recognize you as a friend. Like,
Yes.
and I thought, coming back to North America, which can be so kind of cold and shut down, and you might get a tight little smile from somebody hiking by you on the trail. It's like there's a real intimate moment there, and that's all I'm getting. I thought, man, what a different world it would be if everybody, every time we passed someone, we smiled at them and said, "Hello, friend."
Yeah.
And that's it. We don't have to make a big deal of it, but just that acknowledgement.
Yes.
So, like, imagine the world if every time we went outside and oh my God, the sun's shining. Oh, I'm so glad to
Yes.
see you, my friend. Thanks for showing up again. Without you, we wouldn't be here. Oh,
Yeah.
I mean,
This
if
it's actually
animism
something.
will save the world.
Yeah, no, it's something Hillman talked about, where he talked about us overburdening the personal in terms of the human personal, because we've taken the personhood out of every other realm. So when when it comes to human relationships, they have to carry all of that need for relationality, which means we over disclose, we overweigh human persons, because we could be having those exchanges with the world.
Yeah,
And
talk about your bad day to the rock over
yes,
there. Don't lay it all on your wife when she gets home after a hard day at
right.
work.
Yes, that idea of like, if we had a more differentiated relational space, we wouldn't be like, here, you are going to carry this conversation because I'm not having it with anybody else in the world.
Yeah, yeah. Huh. Oh man, this has been so good. I felt like I met a real kin here. I don't want to let you
Agreed.
go. But man, wouldn't it be great if we could incorporate something into Pacifica's curriculum that was practice based? Like maybe not even practice based, but just practice.
Right.
You
There,
know?
there are programs at Pacifica that are better at this than my own program. My own program is trying to get better at it. Of like, we can't traverse this intellectual space without it being acknowledged in some way, as a embodied process in relationship to the world and cosmology like even in the broadest sense. And so we are trying to be more attentive around that. And there's other programs at Pacifica where sort of ritual and enact, not even as big as ritual, just daily enactment, embodiment of animism, of indigeneity is more sort of interwoven to just what the program is. So there's places at Pacifica that do it much better than our own, but I think all of us are trying to get better at it, and understand, in my own courses at these residential weekends where students come to campus, I have them get out of the classroom and I have them go talk to the world in these ways. Because for me, it's this idea that we can sit in this classroom and talk about the soul of the world and enchantment, and then and then what? Like, no, you gotta, that's a thing that you have to do. Like, so
I had this conversation with Rune Rasmussen, who's a Nordic animism scholar, and he has a YouTube channel and stuff. And we kind of came to this point where we're both in agreement that animism is what the world needs now,
yeah,
and what people need now, and that it could fill that void if there's practices that
yeah,
aren't purely appropriative, but maybe are inspired by
yeah,
to get the ball rolling towards something like a Western shamanism.
right.
That's my term. I know people hate the term shamanism, but too bad. I'm using it. It's the best I've got. It points towards something.
Yes.
Uh, but the question came up. I asked him, "Is animism something that you can fake it until you make it? What do
Right.
you think? Is it worth doing even those gestures, even if they don't feel quite at home in yourself yet?"
I think 100%. Because for me, this is maybe where my depth psychological perspective comes in. Is like, I think that sensibility is there, and it might be sort of overwritten by narratives that discount it. But the more you do the thing, the more the psyche says, yeah, this is what I'm looking for. And I think it can feel very awkward for a long time, and yet there's some other place that says, no, like, this is what the world is, so this is how you live in relationship to it. So I do think there's some value of, it doesn't quite feel real, and yet on the other hand, there's some deeper conviction that is like, no, I gotta be in this relation, I gotta be in this, in a more than intellectual way.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. Just to acknowledge that if you first start doing some, I hate this word animism, by the way, but again,
Here's where I love that word. I
uh,
and the reason I do is because, for me, it actually captures the thing despite the history of how it's been used. For me, it's that thing of like, yes, and everything person, everything relational, everything alive. So
everything has a soul. Yeah.
I love that word despite its history, because for me it holds that resonance of, hello everything.
I know, but I'm more comfortable using it when talking about something out there.
Oh,
But to call myself an animist, ugh,
oh,
I
I hear you.
can't.
I
But
hear you.
like shamanism, like I'm not going to call myself a shaman ever. But shamanism points to something, animism points to something.
Yeah,
So useful term, okay, stand in for something real. But I think it's really nice to acknowledge that when Western people who have been conditioned by this Christian monotheistic culture start to do these practices, it might feel a little weird, a little embarrassing, a little awkward. But I love that idea. Like you're actually you're watering some deeper roots
yeah,
that have been kind of desiccated by
yeah,
monotheism. and it's going to take time for them to start to grow, but they will start to grow, and it'll feel more and more natural.
Yeah.
Like, I think about it as you do the practice until it feels like second nature,
Yeah.
and then you keep doing it until it feels like first nature again.
Yeah. No, and I think this is also where I feel like this kind of thing has to be inseparable from decolonization. Because again, if decolonizing is just an intellectual process, then we're still living colonization.
Right.
We're,
Like if it's only a critique.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the only way you really find out about the ideas you have is when you start to engage with the world in a different way, and your mind starts like flipping out because it's like that feels really counter to this other narrative I have. That's where, for me, colonization really meets sort of its counter, is in that contrast when ways of participating and enacting another way of being meet the mind that says, no, I can't do that. Then it's like, well, what is there? What's occupying my mind that cannot relate to the world in this other way?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the actual embodied decolonization happens, is in that confrontation of doing animism, doing shamanic cosmology, and our intellectual space reacting to that in a way that says, no, this isn't normal. And then you can start saying, well, what do you think is normal, mind?
Mm-hmm.
That this isn't. And you start taking those pieces apart.
Yeah. Why do you think that's
Yeah.
normal?
Yeah.
Even deeper.
Yeah.
Getting some dangerous territory. Jordan Peterson would say, "Oh, stay away.
Yes.
You don't want to fall over the cliff into polytheistic animism.
You don't want to be with the actual world.
You just don't want to regress down there, man. It's dangerous."
Yeah.
But the thing is, okay, but still, like the education system, even the highest education system, is still based on theory, rhetoric, and this is itself uh, indicative of a colonial
Yeah.
valuation of intellect, mind
For
over
sure.
practice, ritual, felt experience, intuition. Oh,
Yeah.
so we've got to like do some deconstruction of the institutions too. So
Absolutely.
I want to come down. I want to do some workshops at Pacifica that are only practice. It's like, just shut up and let's do practice.
Right. Well, I will. I'm gonna um, probably hold you to that at some point. So
um, yeah, and you addressed this, and it was something I was going to ask you. So, first of all, is it possible to re-indigenize, to reconnect to land and recognition of land as interrelational and all that? I think, yeah, you're nodding your head. I knew you'd say yes. But the second follow-up question is, do we need to decolonize before trying to re-indigenize? And I think what you said there is that they happen consecutively.
yeah, I don't think
Because
if
the
anything,
re-indigenization is about the practice and the experience,
yeah,
right? And decolonization has a lot to do with deconstructing mental constructs in a
yes,
way, right?
yeah,
So,
and I think the re-indigenizing, I don't know if that's even, I would say that has never been gone. So there's
yeah.
no, it's a recovery or return, and even that
Mm-hmm.
sounds too far away for me. Of like, oh no, no, it's just been silenced. It's not like you can unindigenize the psyche. You can only silence that part of the psyche. And so I think it is a simultaneous, what is what is keeping that that dimension of life silenced? What are the narratives there? And at some deep level, I can participate in the world like this and find out what opposes that in me. And so I think it is a both and.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes so much sense after we've talked about it. Um, any other authors? I mean, there's nobody like Vine Deloria, I know, but are there any other Indigenous authors who have been addressing Western psychology and having something like not just critical to say, but something creative?
Yeah, the other person that is prominent in my courses and some other programs is Gloria Anzaldúa. She's uh Latinx, mestizo, which is what I am, mixed, and very occupies sort of in academia, very sort of critical lens, feminist, queer, and has some very sort of specific in academia positionality, and yet uses Hillman in particular as a way of challenging academic assumptions, dichotomies, colonization, and enacts it in her writing. Like she'll go from back and forth between languages in a really, for me, rich way, but it's challenging for students to find themselves as the other to this writer language wise. But just the way she moves about using depth psychology and critical theories, not just in what do I want to say, to take things apart. She also is describing puts things in place of a shamanic animistic sensibility of occupying the world in a particular way that is the other to what she's critiquing. So she's brilliant. Like her, I think the last book before she passed, uh, it's called Light in the Dark. Um, and it really displays how she works with depth psychology and multiple critical lenses as a way to get into a deeper indigenous shamanic place to be with the world as alive. Um, she's the other person that immediately comes to mind. There's um, a really fantastic, for lack of a better word, conglomerate of figures in South America. Um, and as a whole, they're called the epistemologies of the South. There's one figure, I think it's De Souza is his last name. He wrote a book called The End of the Cognitive Empire. He's sort of the head figure of multiple people in this conversation. It's so depth psychological, but so, like for me, the sharpest, most sophisticated expression of Southern epistemologies as alternatives, as complicators, as giving voice to the world in other ways. That End of the Cognitive Empire is one of most, I mean, it's one of the most influential books I've ever read on my own way of thinking through these things.
It sounds when I read God is Red,
Yeah.
or when I read Hillman's Revisioning Psychology. You know, there's sometimes these books come along where I feel like so excited and energized by having something that I haven't been able to articulate, but has
Yes.
been kind of lying dormant at the felt sense level or intuitive level. And hearing someone put words to it, it's like it awakens something in me. I'm
Yeah.
getting all over goosebumps just talking about that experience. So
Yeah.
sounds like that was
Uh,
the kind of book for you.
and the thing about that book is he starts talking about what it means to decolonize the institute.
Hmm.
And it's like, even for me, I'm like, yes, like we have to get like, he's like, he starts to really think through what that means. And it's like puts you in really, like, as someone in that space, puts me in positions of like, wow, what would that really mean? And he put some flesh and blood on those concepts as a whole, that put moves it into life in ways that I think are really both troubling in the best sense of that word,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
affirming. Yeah.
Yeah. I love how you describe those complicators. Because,
Yeah.
man, life is freaking complicated. It's
Yes.
complex, okay? Like, that's one of my problems with JP. We'll call him.
Yes.
Is you can,
Correct.
I think that's why people like him, is because, oh, he's really made that very simple and clear,
Yes.
and it's given me like a directive, like a what to do. I'm
Yes.
like,
Make
no,
your
no,
bed.
no.
Like,
Yeah.
okay.
Oh, I can do that. Stand up
Yeah.
straight. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. But complicators. Yeah. Let's make more space for the complicators.
Yep.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate you spending the time with me. It's been such a fun conversation, man. I feel like really met by
Same.
a brother on the same, I don't know, same, our own kind of mission, I guess.
Yeah.
But let's not get too inflated about it.
Exactly.
I just call it soul work. I'm from a blue collar background, and to me, it's just like boots on the ground. What can I do today to help this
Yes.
project of bringing more soul to the world?
Correct. That's how I try to articulate it to myself, as like, be that thing. Like, and when you're in spaces when you can talk about it, talk about that thing, but when no one's looking, talk to the tree. Like, it has to, if I'm not living it, then I'm part of the problem.
Yeah. Great. Anything you doing any online seminars or anything like that where people can tune into your work?
No, I mean, I that's why, I appreciate you opening up this kind of space for this kind of conversation, as it sort of gets to audiences that aren't going to be in my, in my classroom, or that I'm not going to necessarily be hearing from either. And so I really appreciate and honor the work you're doing, because it puts conversations into streams that it needs to be in, beyond where I reside. So it's you doing this as part as part of the work, I think. And so
Yeah,
thank you.
great. My pleasure, man. So maybe when I get into these other books you recommended, Light in the Dark and End of Cognitive Empire, maybe I can have you back and we can dig into those and do our part as complicators.
Yeah, I would be
Cool.
honored. I really would.
Awesome. All right. Take care. Thanks again, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Take care.